Chapter 17. The Circulation of Surplus Value. We have already seen how the variation in the turnover period produces a variation in the annual rate of surplus value, even with the mass of surplus value annually produced remaining the same. There is, however, a further necessary variation in the capitalization of surplus value, in accumulation, and in this respect also in the mass of surplus value produced during the year, even with the rate of surplus value remaining the same. We note first of all that capitalist A, in the example of the preceding chapter, has a steady periodic revenue, and so if we accept the turnover period with which he starts business, he meets his own consumption during the year out of his production of surplus value, and does not have to advance anything for this out of his own funds. This is the position, however, with B. Capitalist B produces the same amount of surplus value in the same time as A does, but the surplus value is not realized and can therefore be consumed neither individually nor productively. So far as individual consumption is concerned, surplus value is anticipated. Funds for this must be advanced. A part of the productive capital which is difficult to categorize, i.e., the extra capital needed for repair and maintenance of the fixed capital, now presents itself in a new light. In case A, this part of the capital is either not advanced at the start of production or is only advanced to a small extent. It does not need to be available, let alone actually present. It arises from the business itself, by the direct transformation of surplus value into capital, i.e. its direct application as capital. A part of the surplus value that is not only produced periodically in the course of the year but also realized can cover the expenses necessary for repairs, etc. In this way, a part of the capital needed to conduct the business on its original scale is produced by the business itself, in the course of business, by the capitalization of a part of the surplus value. This is impossible for capitalist B. The portion of capital in question must in his case form part of the capital originally advanced. In both cases, this part of the capital figures in the capitalist's books as capital advanced, which indeed it is, since on our assumption it forms a part of the productive capital needed to carry on business on the given scale. But it makes a great difference whose funds it is advanced out of. In case B, it is an actual part of the capital that has to be originally advanced or kept available. In case A, on the other hand, it is a portion of the surplus value applied as capital. This latter case shows us how not only the capital accumulated, but also a part of the capital originally advanced, can simply be capitalized surplus value. Once the development of credit intervenes, the relation between the capital originally advanced and the capitalized surplus value becomes still more intricate. For example, A may borrow part of the productive capital with which he begins his business, or carries it on during the year from banker C. At the start, therefore, he lacks sufficient capital of his own to conduct the business. Banker C lends him a sum that simply consists of surplus value deposited with him by industrialists D, E, F, etc. From A's standpoint, it is still not accumulated capital. In point of fact, however, for D, E, F, etc., A is no more than an agent who capitalizes the surplus value that they have appropriated. In Chapter 24 of Volume 1, we saw how the real content of accumulation, the transformation of surplus value into capital, is the reproduction process on an expanded scale, whether this expansion expresses itself extensively in the form of the addition of new factories to old ones, or intensively in the enlargement of the former scale of operations. The expansion of the scale of production can proceed in relatively small doses if a part of the surplus value is applied to improvements which either simply raise the productive power of the labor applied or allow it simultaneously to be more intensively exploited. Alternatively, when the working day is not restricted by law, an additional outlay of circulating capital, in production materials and wages, permits an expansion of the scale of production without any increase in the fixed capital, since the time during which the latter is used is thus simply prolonged, while its turnover period is correspondingly shortened. Alternatively again, the capitalized surplus value, given favorable market conjunctures, may permit speculation in raw materials, operations for which the capital originally advanced would have been insufficient, and so on. It is clear, however, that where a relatively large number of turnover periods brings about a more frequent realization of surplus value in the course of the year, periods do occur in which the working day cannot be extended, nor can individual improvements be brought about, while, on the other hand, extension of the whole business on a proportional scale, partly by expanding the entire plant, the buildings, for example, partly by increasing the labor fund, as in agriculture, is possible only within certain limits, which may be broader or narrower, and requires a volume of additional capital that can only be supplied by several years' accumulation of surplus value. Besides real accumulation, or the transformation of surplus value into productive capital, and correspondingly reproduction on an expanded scale, There is thus accumulation of money, scraping together a part of the surplus value as latent money capital, which is only to function as additional active capital later on, when it has attained a certain volume. This is how the matter appears from the standpoint of the individual capitalist. With the development of capitalist production, however, there occurs a simultaneous development in the credit system. The money capital that the capitalist cannot yet apply in his own business is employed by others from whom he receives interest. It functions for him as money capital in the specific sense that it is a kind of capital distinct from productive capital, but it is in someone else's hands that it actually operates as capital. It is clear that with the more frequent realization of surplus value and the rising scale on which it is produced, a growth occurs in the proportion in which new money capital, or money as capital, is placed on the money market, and at least a large part of this is absorbed again from the money markets for the expansion of production. The simplest form which this extra latent money capital can assume is that of a hoard. This hoard may be additional gold or silver received directly or indirectly in exchange with the countries producing precious metals. It is only in this way, moreover, that the money hoard within a country grows in absolute terms. It is possible, on the other hand, however, and this is the position in the majority of cases, that this hoard is nothing more than money withdrawn from domestic circulation, which has assumed the form of a hoard in the hands of individual capitalists. It is also possible that this latent money capital consists simply of value tokens. We are still leaving credit money out of account here, or else mere claims, titles of the capitalist on third parties established by legal documents. In all these cases, whatever may be the form of existence of the extra money capital, it represents, inasmuch as it is prospective capital, no more than extra legal titles to the future additional production of the society that the capitalists hold in reserve. Quote, "The mass of real accumulated wealth in point of magnitude is so utterly insignificant when compared with the powers of production of the same society in whatever state of civilization, or even compared with the actual consumption for even a few years of that society, that the great attention of legislators and political economists should be directed to productive powers and their future free development, and not, as hitherto, to a mere accumulated wealth that strikes the eye. Of what is called accumulated wealth, by far the greater part is only nominal, consisting not of any real things, ships, houses, cottons, improvements on land, but of mere demands on the future annual productive powers of society, engendered and perpetuated by the expedients or institutions of insecurity. The use of such articles, accumulations of physical things or actual wealth, as a mere means of appropriating to their possessors the wealth to be created by the future productive powers of society, being that alone of which the natural laws of distribution would, without force, gradually deprive them, or, if aided by cooperative labor, would in a very few years deprive them." End quote from William Thomson, An Inquiry into the Principles of the Distribution of Wealth, published in London in 1850. This book originally appeared in 1824. Quote, "It is little thought, by most persons not at all suspected, how very small a proportion, either in extent or influence, the actual accumulations of society bear to human productive powers, even to the ordinary consumption of a few years of a single generation. The reason is obvious, but the effect is very pernicious. The wealth that is annually consumed, disappearing with its consumption, is seen but for a moment, and makes no impression but during the act of enjoyment or use. But that part of wealth which is of slow consumption, furniture, machinery, buildings, from childhood to old age stand out before the eye, the durable moments of human exertion. By means of the possession of this fixed, permanent, or slowly consumed part of national wealth, of the land and materials to work upon, the tools to work with, the houses to shelter whilst working, the holders of these articles command for their own benefit the yearly productive powers of all the really efficient productive laborers of society, though these articles may bear ever so small a proportion to the recurring products of that labor. The population of Britain and Ireland being 20 millions, the average consumption of each individual, man, woman, and child, is probably about 20 pounds, making 400 millions of wealth, the product of labor annually consumed. The whole amount of the accumulated capital of these countries, it has been estimated, does not exceed 1,200 millions, or 3 times the year's labor of the community, or, if equally divided, 60 pounds capital for every individual. It is with the proportions rather than with the absolute accurate amount of these estimated sums we are concerned. The interest of this capital stock would support the whole population in the same comfort in which they now exist for about 2 months of 1 year, and the whole accumulated capital itself would maintain them in idleness, could purchasers be found, for 3 years, at the end of which time, without houses, clothes, or food, they must starve, or become the slaves of those who supported them in the 3 years' idleness. As 3 years is to the life of one healthy generation, say 40 years, so is the magnitude and importance of the actual wealth, the accumulated capital of even the wealthiest community, to the productive powers of only one generation. Not of what, under judicious arrangements of equal security, they might produce, particularly with the aid of cooperative labor, but of what, under the defective and depressing expedients of insecurity, they do absolutely produce. As nothing can be accumulated without first supplying necessaries, and as the great current of human inclination is to enjoyment, hence the comparatively trifling amount of the actual wealth of society at any particular moment. It is an eternal round of production and consumption. From the amount of this immense mass of annual consumption and production, the handful of actual accumulation would hardly be missed, and yet it is to this handful, and not to the mass of productive powers, that attention has chiefly been directed. About 1/3 of the annual products of the labor of these countries is now abstracted from the producers, under the name of public burdens, and unproductively consumed by those who give no equivalent, that is to say, none satisfactory to the producers. With the accumulated masses, particularly when held forth in the hands of a few individuals, the vulgar eye has always been struck. The annually produced and consumed masses, like the eternal and incalculable waves of a mighty river, roll on and are lost in the forgotten ocean of consumption. On this eternal consumption, however, are dependent, not only for almost all gratifications, but even for existence, the whole human race. The quantity and distribution of these yearly products ought to be the paramount objects for consideration. The actual accumulation is altogether of secondary importance, and derives almost the whole of that importance from its influence on the distribution of the yearly productions. Actual accumulations and distributions have always been considered, in reference and subordinate to the power of producing. In almost all other systems, the power of producing has been considered in reference and subordinate to actual accumulation, and to the perpetuating of the existing modes of distribution. In comparison to the preservation of this actual distribution, the ever-recurring misery or happiness of the whole human race has been considered as unworthy of regard. To perpetuate the results of force, fraud, and chance has been called security, and to the support of this spurious security have all the productive powers of the human race been unrelentingly sacrificed." End quote. As far as reproduction is concerned, only 2 normal cases are possible, leaving aside disturbances which inhibit reproduction even on the existing scale. Either reproduction occurs on a simple scale, or, alternatively, there is capitalization of surplus value, accumulation. Section 1. Simple reproduction. In the case of simple reproduction, the surplus value that is periodically produced and realized, either annually or by several turnovers within the year, is consumed individually, i.e., unproductively by its owners, the capitalists. The fact that the value of products consists partly of surplus value and partly of the portion of value formed by the variable capital reproduced in it, together with the constant capital consumed, does not change in the least either the volume or the value of the total product which enters circulation at any given time as commodity capital, and is similarly withdrawn from it to go into productive or individual consumption, i.e., to serve as means of production or means of consumption. Leaving aside the constant capital, it is only the distribution of the annual product between workers and capitalists that is thereby affected. Even supposing simple reproduction, one part of the surplus value must always exist in money and not in products, because it cannot otherwise be transformed from money into product for the needs of consumption. This transformation of surplus value from its original commodity form into money must now be investigated further. To simplify the matter, we take the problem in its simplest form, i.e., the exclusive circulation of metallic money, of money that is a real equivalent. According to the laws developed for simple commodity circulation, see Volume 1, Chapter 3, the mass of metallic money existing in a currency cannot just be enough to circulate the commodities. It must be sufficient to cope with the fluctuations in the circulation of money, which arise partly from fluctuations in the speed of circulation, partly from changes in the price of commodities, and partly from the different and changing proportions in which the money functions as means of payment and as means of circulation proper. The ratio in which the existing mass of money is divided into a hoard and into money in circulation constantly changes, but the mass of money is always equal to the sum of money present as a hoard and as money in circulation. This quantity of money, the quantity of precious metal, is a social hoard accumulated bit by bit. Inasmuch as a part of this hoard is consumed by wear and tear, it must be replaced each year, as with any other product. This happens in reality by the direct or indirect exchange of a part of the annual product of the country in question with the product of the gold and silver producing countries. The international character of this transaction conceals its simple course. In order to reduce the problem to its simplest and most perceptible expression, we must therefore assume that there is production of gold and silver in the country itself, i.e., that gold and silver production form a part of the total social production of any country. Ignoring the gold and silver produced for luxury articles, the minimum annual production of these metals must be equal to the wear and tear of the money metals occasioned by the annual monetary circulation. Moreover, if the value of the mass of commodities annually produced and circulated grows, then the annual production of gold and silver must also grow, insofar as the increased value of the commodities in circulation and the quantity of money required for this circulation and for the corresponding hoard formation is not compensated for by a greater velocity of monetary circulation and by the more comprehensive function of money as means of payment, i.e., by more mutual settlement of sales and purchases without the intervention of actual money. A part of the social labor power and a part of the social means of production must therefore be spent each year in the production of gold and silver. The capitalists who pursue the production of gold and silver, and since we are here assuming simple reproduction, they pursue it only within the bounds of the average annual wear and tear and the average annual consumption of gold and silver necessitated by that wear and tear, directly cast their surplus value, which according to our supposition they consume each year without capitalizing any of it, into the circulation sphere in the money form, which is for them the natural form of their product, not, as with the other branches of production, its transformed form. Furthermore, as far as wages are concerned, the money form in which the variable capital is advanced, here too they are not replaced by the sale of the product, its transformation into money, but rather by a product whose natural form is money from the very beginning. Finally, this also applies to the part of the total precious metal product that is equal in value to the whole of the constant capital periodically consumed, including both the constant circulating capital and the constant fixed capital consumed during the year. Let us firstly consider the circuit or turnover of the capital invested in the production of precious metals in the form M to C to P to M prime. Insofar as the C in M to C does not consist only of labor power and means of production, but also of fixed capital, only a part of whose value is used up in P, it is evident that M prime, the product, is a sum of money equal to the variable capital laid out on wages, plus the circulating constant capital laid out on means of production, plus the portion of value of the fixed capital used up, plus the surplus value. If the sum were smaller, with the general value of the gold unchanged, then the mines in question would be unprofitable. Or, if this is generally the case, the value of gold would in future rise, compared with commodities whose value was unchanged, i.e., the prices of commodities would fall, so that the sum of money laid out in M to C would in the future be less. Let us start by considering only the circulating part of the capital advanced in M, the starting point of M to C to P to M prime. In this case, a certain sum of money is advanced and cast into circulation in payment for labor power, and in order to purchase materials of production. The money is not withdrawn again from circulation by the circuit of this capital and then cast in afresh. The product in its natural form is already money. It does not need to be first transformed into money by exchange, by process of circulation. It moves from the production process into the circulation sphere not in the form of commodity capital that has to be transformed back into money capital, but rather as money capital that has to be transformed back into productive capital, i.e. has to buy new labor power and materials of production. The money form of the circulating capital, that consumed in labor power and means of production, is replaced not by the sale of the product, but rather by the natural form of the product itself, i.e. not by withdrawing its value again from circulation in the money form, but rather by adding money newly produced. Let us assume that this circulating capital is £500, and the turnover period 5 weeks, a 4-week working period with the circulation period only 1 week. Right from the start, money has in part to be advanced for 5 weeks in a production stock, and in part kept on hand to be paid out bit by bit as wages. At the beginning of the 6th week, £400 is returned and £100 been set free. This is continually repeated. Here, as before, £100 always exists in the released form for a certain section of the turnover, but this consists of additional money newly produced, just like the other £400. Here we have 10 turnovers in the year, and the annual product is £5,000 in gold. The circulation period here does not arise from the time taken to transform commodities into money, but rather that taken to transform money into the elements of production. For any other capital of £500, turning over under the same conditions, the constantly renewed money form is the changed form of the commodity capital produced, a capital which is cast into circulation every 4 weeks and always receives this money form afresh by its sale, i.e. by the periodic withdrawal of the sum of money in the shape of which it originally entered the process. Here, on the contrary, in every turnover period, a new additional sum of £500 in money is cast into circulation by the production process, so as to keep withdrawing materials of production and labor power from circulation. The money thus cast into the circulation sphere is not withdrawn from it again by the circuit of this capital, but rather by the increased quantity of new gold that is constantly produced. If we consider the variable part of this circulating capital and take it to be £100, as above, then this £100 would in ordinary commodity production be sufficient to pay labor power through a tenfold turnover. Here, in money production, the same sum is also sufficient. However, the 5-weekly reflux of £100 with which the labor power is paid is not the changed form of its product, but rather a part of its ever-new product itself. The gold producer pays his workers directly with a part of the gold they have themselves produced. Thus, the £1,000 that is laid out each year on labor power and thrown into circulation by the workers does not return via circulation to its starting point. As far as the fixed capital is concerned, moreover, the initial establishment of the business requires the expenditure of a relatively large money capital, which is thus cast into the circulation sphere. Like all fixed capital, this only returns back bit by bit over a number of years, but it flows back as a direct fragment of the product, the gold, not by the sale of the product and its consequent conversion into monetary form. Thus, it does not receive its money form by a withdrawal of money from circulation, but rather by the accumulation of a corresponding part of the product. The money capital thus re-established is not a sum of money gradually withdrawn from circulation to balance the sum of money originally cast into it for fixed capital. It is an additional quantity of money. Finally, as far as the surplus value is concerned, this is also equal to a part of the new gold product that is cast into circulation in each new turnover period, to be spent unproductively according to our assumption and paid out for means of subsistence and luxury articles. According to our assumption, however, this entire annual gold production, through which labor power and materials of production, though not money, are steadily withdrawn from the market and additional money is steadily supplied to it, only replaces the money worn out during the year, and thus simply keeps intact the social money stock which always exists in the two forms of hoard and money in circulation, though in varying proportions. According to the law of commodity circulation, the total quantity of money must be equal to the quantity of money required for circulation plus a sum of money existing in the hoard form which increases or decreases according to the contraction or expansion of circulation, and serves in particular for the formation of the reserve fund of means of payment that is needed. What has to be paid in money, insofar as there is no direct balancing of accounts, is the value of the commodities. The fact that part of this value consists of surplus value, i.e. has cost the seller of the commodity nothing, does not change this situation in any way. If the producers all possessed their means of production independently, there would then be the circulation between the direct producers themselves. Ignoring the constant part of their capital, we could divide their annual surplus product, by analogy with the situation under capitalism, into two parts. Part A, which simply replaces their necessary means of subsistence, and Part B, which they partly consume as luxury products and partly apply to the expansion of production. Part A then represents the variable capital, Part B the surplus value. But this division would still have no effect on the quantity of money required to circulate their total product. With circumstances otherwise remaining the same, the value of the mass of commodities in circulation would be the same, and so would the quantity of money required by it. They would also have to have the same money reserves as before, given a similar division of the turnover period, i.e. the same part of their capital would always have to be in the money form, on our continued supposition that their production was commodity production. Thus, the circumstance that a part of the commodity value consists of surplus value does not alter in the least the quantity of money needed to carry on the business. An opponent of Tuch, who supports the form M to C to M prime, asked him how the capitalist always managed to withdraw more money from circulation than he cast into it. Let us be clear that what is involved here is not the formation of surplus value. This, the only real secret, is taken for granted by the capitalists. The sum of value invested would not be capital if it did not enrich itself with a surplus value. Hence, surplus value is assumed from the outset. Its existence is a matter of course. Thus, the question is not, where does surplus value come from, but rather, where does the money come from which it is turned into? In bourgeois economics, the existence of surplus value is taken for granted. Thus, not only is it presupposed, but it is also presupposed at the same time that a part of the mass of commodities cast into circulation consists of surplus product, and thus represents a value that the capitalist did not cast into circulation with his capital, that the capitalist therefore casts into circulation an excess over and above his capital, and withdraws this excess from it again. The commodity capital that the capitalist casts into circulation is of greater value than the productive capital he has withdrawn in labor power and means of production from the circulation sphere. Why this should be so is not explained or understood from the capitalist standpoint, but it is a fact for all that. On this assumption, it is therefore clear why not only capitalist A, but also B, C, D, etc., can always withdraw from circulation, by exchanging their commodities, more value than the value of their original capital, which is always advanced anew. A, B, C, D, etc. always cast a greater commodity value into circulation in the form of commodity capital, an operation which has as many sides to it as there are independently functioning capitals, then they withdraw from it in the form of productive capital. Thus, they always have a value sum to share among themselves, i.e., each of them can withdraw from circulation a productive capital equal to the value of the productive capitals they have respectively advanced, and can just as regularly share out a value sum which they cast into circulation from just as many sides in the commodity form, as a respective surplus of commodity value over the value of their commodities' elements of production. But before the commodity capital is transformed back into productive capital, and the surplus value contained in it is spent, it must be turned into money. Where does the money for this come from? This question appears difficult at first glance, and neither Tuke nor anyone else has yet answered it. Assume that the circulating capital of £500 advanced in the form of money capital, whatever may be its turnover period, is the total circulating capital of society, i.e. of the capitalist class. The surplus value is £100. How then can the entire capitalist class continue extracting £600 from the circulation sphere if it only ever puts £500 into it? Once the money capital of £500 has been transformed into productive capital, this is transformed within the production process into a commodity value of £600, and there now exists in the circulation sphere not only a commodity value of £500, equal to the money capital originally advanced, but also a newly produced surplus value of £100. This extra surplus value of £100 is cast into circulation in the commodity form. There is no doubt about that. But the extra money needed for the circulation of this additional commodity value is not provided by the same operation. The difficulty should not be circumvented by plausible subterfuges. For example, as far as concerns the constant circulating capital, it is clear that not all of it is laid out at the same time. While capitalist A is selling his commodities, and thus the capital he has advanced is assuming the money form, the capital of buyer B, which is present in the money form, is assuming the form of B's means of production, and it is A himself who produces these. By the same act through which A gives back its money form to the commodity capital he has produced, B gives his capital back its productive form, transforming it from the money form into means of production and labor power. The same sum of money functions in the two-way process just as in every simple sale C to M. On the other hand, if A transforms his money into means of production again, he buys from C, and this latter thereby pays B, etc. The transaction might thus appear to have been explained. However, none of the laws put forward with respect to the quantity of money circulating for the purpose of commodity circulation, see Volume 1, Chapter 3, are in any way altered by the capitalist character of the production process. Therefore, when it is said that the circulating capital advanced by society in the money form amounts to £500, it has already been taken into account that this is not the only sum which was advanced at the same time, but that this sum also sets more productive capital than £500 in motion, since it serves alternately as the money fund for different productive capitals. This mode of explanation already presupposes that the money exists, whereas it is precisely its existence that is to be explained. It might further be said that capitalist A produces articles that capitalist B consumes individually and unproductively. B's money thus turns A's commodity capital into money, and so the same sum of money serves to turn into money both B's surplus value and A's circulating constant capital. But here the solution to the question that is to be answered is presupposed even more directly. Namely, where does B get this money to meet his revenue? How did he himself manage to convert into money this part of his product's surplus value? It might be said, again, that the part of the circulating variable capital that A advances at any one time to his workers constantly flows back to him from the circulation sphere. Only a changing part of it is kept back by him for the payment of wages. Between the outlay and the reflux there is, however, a certain interval, in the course of which the money paid out in wages can serve among other things to convert this surplus value into money. However, we know firstly that the greater this interval, the greater must be the quantity of money in reserve which capitalist A must constantly retain in his possession. Secondly, if the workers pay the money out and buy commodities with it, the surplus value contained in these commodities is also proportionately converted into money. Thus, the same money that is advanced in the form of variable capital also serves to that extent to convert the surplus value into money. Without going any deeper into the question here, It is at least clear that the consumption of the entire capitalist class, and the unproductive persons dependent on it, keeps even pace with that of the working class. Thus, on top of the money cast into circulation by the workers, money must be cast into circulation by the capitalists if they are to spend their surplus value as revenue, and so money for this must be withdrawn from circulation. The explanation just given would only reduce the quantity needed, and not obviate the need. It might be said, finally, a large amount of money is always cast into circulation on the first investment of the fixed capital, and this is withdrawn from circulation again only gradually, bit by bit, in the course of several years by whoever threw it in. Is this sum not sufficient to convert the surplus value? The answer to this is that the sum of £500, which also includes hoard formation for the necessary reserve fund, may well already imply the investment of this sum as fixed capital, if not by the person who cast it in, then at least by someone else. Besides, it is already presupposed, in connection with the sum that is spent on the acquisition of products serving as fixed capital, that the surplus value in these commodities is also paid for, and the question precisely arises, where does this money come from? The general answer has already been given. If a mass of commodities of X times £1,000 is to circulate, it in no way affects the quantity of money needed for this circulation, whether the value of this commodity mass contains surplus value or not, or whether the mass of commodities is produced under capitalist conditions or not. Thus, the problem itself does not exist. With conditions otherwise given, such as the velocity of circulation of the money, etc., a definite sum of money is required to circulate the commodity value of X times £1,000, quite irrespective of how much or how little of this value accrues to the direct producers of these commodities. Inasmuch as a problem does exist here, it coincides with the general problem. Where does the sum of money needed in a country for the circulation of commodities come from? However, there does exist, from the standpoint of capitalist production, the semblance of a special problem. For here it is the capitalist, the man who casts his money into circulation, who appears as the point of departure. The money that the worker spends in payment for his means of subsistence existed previously as the money form of the variable capital, and was therefore originally cast into circulation by the capitalist as means of purchase or payment for labor power. Moreover, the money that the capitalist casts into circulation originally constituted the money form of his constant fixed or fluid capital. He spends it as means of purchase or payment for means of labor and production materials. Beyond this, however, the capitalist no longer appears as the point of departure for the quantity of money that exists in circulation. All that exist now are two starting points, the capitalist and the worker. All third parties must either receive money from these two classes for the performance of services, or, insofar as they receive money without providing services in return, they are co-proprietors of surplus value in the forms of rent, interest, etc. If the surplus value does not all remain in the pockets of the industrial capitalist but has to be shared by him with other persons, this has nothing to do with the question at issue. What was asked is how he converts his surplus value into money, not how the money obtained for it is then divided up. For the present case, therefore, we can still consider the capitalist as the sole owner of surplus value. As far as the workers are concerned, it has already been said that they are only a secondary point of departure, whereas the capitalist is the primary point of departure for the money cast into circulation by the workers. The money that is first advanced as variable capital is already performing its second circulation when the worker spends it in payment for means of subsistence. Thus, the capitalist class remains the sole starting point of the money circulation. If it needs £400 for payment for means of production and £100 for payment of labor power, then it casts £500 into circulation. But the surplus value contained in the product, given a rate of surplus value of 100%, makes up a value of £100. How can the capitalist class continue to extract £600 from circulation if it only ever puts £500 in? Out of nothing, nothing comes. The entire capitalist class cannot extract anything from the circulation sphere that was not put into it already. We disregard here the fact that the sum of £400 in money may be sufficient, given a tenfold turnover, to circulate means of production to a value of £4,000 and labor to a value of £1,000, while the remaining £100 may suffice for the circulation of £1,000 surplus value. This ratio between the sum of money and the commodity value circulated by it contributes nothing to the matter in hand. The problem remains the same. If the same piece of money did not undergo several circulations, then £5,000 would have to be cast into circulation as capital, and £1,000 would be needed to convert the surplus value into money. The question is where this money comes from, whether it is £1,000 or £100. In either case, it is additional money capital cast into circulation. In point of fact, paradoxical as it may seem at the first glance, the capitalist class itself casts into circulation the money that serves towards the realization of the surplus value contained in its commodities. But note well, it does not cast this in as money advanced, and therefore not as capital. It spends it as means of purchase for its individual consumption. Thus the money is not advanced by the capitalist class, even though this class is the starting point of its circulation. Let us take a particular capitalist who sets up a business, a farmer for example. During the first year, he advances a money capital of £5,000. Let us say in payment for means of production £4,000, and for labor power £1,000. If the rate of surplus value is 100%, then the surplus value he appropriates is £1,000. The above £5,000 includes all the money that he advances as money capital. But the man must also live, and he does not take in any money until the end of the year. Say that his consumption comes to £1,000. He must then have this in hand. He admittedly tells us that he has to advance this £1,000 for the first year, but this is an advance only in the subjective sense, and means nothing more than he has to cover his individual consumption for the first year out of his own pocket, instead of using the product produced for nothing by his workers. He does not advance this money as capital. He spends it, i.e. pays it out for an equivalent in means of subsistence which he then consumes. This value is spent by him in money, cast into circulation, and withdrawn from it in commodity values. These commodity values are consumed by him. Thus he has ceased to stand in any relationship to their value. The money with which he pays for it exists as a component of the circulating money stock, but he has withdrawn the value of this money from circulation in products, and the value of these products is destroyed together with the products in which it existed. It is all gone. At the end of the year, then, he throws into circulation a commodity value of £6,000 and sells this. There returns to him as a result 1. The money capital of £5,000 that he advanced, 2. His converted surplus value of £1,000. He advanced £5,000 as capital, cast this into circulation, and he withdraws from circulation £6,000, £5,000 as capital and £1,000 for surplus value. The final £1,000 is converted into money with the money that he threw into circulation not as capitalist but as consumer, i.e. did not advance but actually spent. It now returns to him as the money form of the surplus value produced by him, and from now on this operation is repeated annually. From the second year, however, the £1,000 that he spends is always the changed form, the money form, of the surplus value he produced. He spends this annually, and it returns to him at the same interval. If his capital were to turn over several times in the course of the year, this would not change things in any way, even though it would affect the length of time for which he had to cast into circulation, over and above the money capital he advanced, this sum for his individual consumption, and hence also the magnitude of the sum involved. This money is not cast into circulation by the capitalist as capital. However, it certainly pertains to the character of the capitalist that he should be capable of living off the means of subsistence in his possession until the reflux of his surplus value. It was assumed in this case that the sum of money that the capitalist casts into circulation to cover his individual consumption until the first reflux of his capital is exactly equal to the surplus value that he produces, and hence has to convert into money. This is obviously an arbitrary assumption in relation to the individual capitalist, but it must be correct for the capitalist class as a whole, on the assumption of simple reproduction. It simply expresses the same thing as this assumption implies, namely that the entire surplus value is unproductively consumed, but no more than this, i.e. no fraction of the original capital stock. It was assumed above that the entire production of precious metals, taken as £500, was just sufficient to replace the wear and tear of the money. The gold-producing capitalists possess their entire product in gold, including the part of it which replaces constant capital, the part which replaces variable capital, and the part which consists of surplus value. One part of the society's surplus value thus consists of gold, and not of products that are turned into money only in the course of circulation. It consists of gold from the start, and is cast into the circulation sphere in order to withdraw products from this. The same applies here to wages, the variable capital, and to the replacement of the constant capital advanced. Thus, if one section of the capitalist class cast into circulation a commodity value greater by the surplus value than the money capital they advanced, another section of the capitalists cast into circulation a greater money value, greater by the surplus value than the commodity value they constantly withdraw from circulation for the production of gold. If one group of capitalists constantly pump more money out of the circulation sphere than they put into it, the gold-producing group constantly pump more money in than they withdraw from it in means of production. Now, even though a part of the £500 gold product is surplus value for the gold producers, the entire sum is still simply determined by the replacement of the money needed for the circulation of commodities. How much of this converts the surplus value of the commodities into money, and how much the other component parts of their value, is immaterial here. If gold production is transferred from the country in question to other countries, this does not alter the situation in any way. A part of the social labor power and social means of production in country A is transformed into a product, for example linen, to the value of £500, and this is exported to country B in order to buy gold there. The productive capital thus applied in country A no more throws commodities onto the market in country A as opposed to money than if it had been directly applied in gold production. This product of A is represented by 500 pounds in gold and comes into circulation in country A only as money. The part of the social surplus value that this product contains exists directly in money, and as far as country A goes, never in any other form. Although for the gold-producing capitalists, only one part of their product is surplus value, while another represents the replacement of capital. The question as to how much of this gold, besides for circulating constant capital, replaces variable capital and how much represents surplus value depends exclusively on the respective ratios of wages and surplus value to the value of the commodities in circulation. The part that forms surplus value is divided between the various members of the capitalist class. Even though it is continuously paid out for their individual consumption and taken in again by the sale of new products, and it is precisely this buying and selling that circulates among them the money needed for the conversion of surplus value, a part of the social surplus value still exists in the form of money in the pockets of the capitalists, even if in changing portions, just as a part of the workers' wages remain in their pockets in the form of money for at least part of the week. And this part is not restricted by the part of the gold product that originally forms the surplus value of the gold-producing capitalists, but rather, as we have already said, by the proportion in which the above product of 500 pounds is divided between capitalists and workers in general, and in which the commodity value consists of surplus value and the other components of value. Still, the part of the surplus value that does not exist in other commodities, but rather alongside these other commodities in money, only consists of a part of the gold annually produced insofar as a part of the annual gold production circulates in order to realize surplus value. The other part of the money, which exists in ever-changing portions in the hands of the capitalist class as the money form of their surplus value, is not an element of the gold annually produced, but rather of the quantity of money previously accumulated in the country. On our supposition, the annual gold production of 500 pounds is just sufficient to replace the money annually worn down. Thus, if we simply bear in mind this 500 pounds and abstract from the part of the mass of commodities annually produced which circulate by means of the money previously accumulated, then the surplus value produced in the form of commodities already finds in circulation money for its conversion, because at another point, surplus value is annually being produced in the form of gold. The same applies to the other parts of the gold product of 500 pounds that replace the money capital advanced. There are 2 points to be noted here. It follows firstly that the surplus value spent by the capitalists in money, as well as the variable and other productive capital which they advance in money, is in fact the product of the workers, in particular of those workers occupied in gold production. These produce afresh both the part of the gold product that is advanced to them as wages and the part of the gold product in which the surplus value of the capitalist gold producers is directly represented. Finally, as far as concerns the part of the gold product that simply replaces the constant capital value advanced for its production, this reappears in the gold form, or in any kind of product, only as a result of the annual labor of the workers. At the start of the business, it was originally given out by the capitalist in money which was not newly produced but formed a part of the social quantity of money in circulation. However, insofar as it is replaced by a new product, additional gold, it is the annual product of the workers. The advance on the part of the capitalist appears here too only as a form deriving from the fact that the worker is neither the proprietor of his own means of production, nor does he have at his disposal during the course of production the means of subsistence produced by other workers. Secondly, however, as far as concerns the quantity of money that exists independently of this annual replacement of 500 pounds, partly in the form of a hoard, partly in the form of a quantity of money in circulation, the same must apply to it, i.e. the same must have originally applied as still applies to this annual 500 pounds. We shall return to this point at the conclusion of this section. In the meantime, some other points must be noted. In considering the turnover, we have already seen that with circumstances otherwise remaining the same, changes in the length of the turnover periods make different amounts of capital necessary in order to continue production on the same scale. The monetary circulation must thus be elastic enough to adapt to this alternate expansion and contraction. If we further assume that other circumstances remain the same, and therefore that there is no change in the size, intensity, or productivity of the working day, but that there is an altered division of the value product between wages and surplus value, so that either the former rises and the latter falls, or vice versa, then the quantity of money in circulation is not affected. This change can come about without any kind of expansion or contraction in the quantity of money in circulation. If we consider, for instance, the case of a general rise in wages, and on the conditions here assumed, a consequent general fall in the rate of surplus value, there would not be, again on the assumptions made here, any change in the value of the mass of commodities in circulation. In this case, moreover, the money capital that has to be advanced as variable capital would grow, and so would the quantity of money that serves for this function. But this being the case, surplus value would decline by the same amount as the increase in the quantity of money required for the function of variable capital, and thus so would the quantity of money needed for its realization. The quantity of money needed to realize the commodity value is therefore no more affected than is this commodity value itself. The cost price of the commodities rises for the individual capitalist, but their social price of production remains unaltered. What is changed is the ratio in which, leaving aside the constant portion of the value, the production price of the commodities is divided between wages and profit. It will be said, however, that a greater outlay of variable money capital means a correspondingly greater quantity of monetary means in the hands of the workers. The value of the money is of course assumed to be constant here. This gives rise to a greater demand for commodities on the part of the workers. A further consequence is a rise in the price of commodities. Alternatively, it is said that if wages rise, the capitalists will increase the prices of their commodities. In both cases, the general rise in wages leads to a rise in the price of commodities. Thus, a greater quantity of money must be needed to circulate the commodities, whether the price rise is explained in one way or the other. The reply to the first of these conceptions is that as a result of rising wages, the demand of the workers for necessary means of subsistence will grow. Their demand for luxury articles will increase to a smaller degree, or else a demand will arise for articles that previously did not enter the area of their consumption. The sudden and large-scale rise in demand for necessary means of subsistence will certainly cause a temporary rise in their prices. The result of this is that a greater part of the social capital will be applied to the production of necessary means of subsistence and a smaller part to the production of luxury goods, since the latter will have fallen in price on account of the decline of surplus value and the resulting diminished demand for them from the capitalists. To the extent that the workers themselves buy luxury goods, however, the rise in their wages does not lead to a rise in the prices of necessary means of subsistence, but simply displaces the buyers of luxury goods. More luxury goods than before are consumed by the workers, and relatively fewer are consumed by the capitalists. That is all. After a few oscillations, the mass of commodities in circulation is the same in value as before. As for these temporary oscillations, moreover, they can have no other result than to cast into domestic circulation, as unoccupied money capital, capital which formerly sought employment in speculative undertakings on the stock exchange or abroad. The reply to the second conception is this. If it were within the capacity of the capitalist producers to increase the prices of their commodities at will, then they could and would do so even without any rise in wages. Nor would wages rise with a fall in commodity prices. The capitalist class would never oppose trade unions, since they would always and in all circumstances be able to do what they now do exceptionally under certain particular and so to speak local conditions, i.e. use any increase in wages to raise commodity prices to a far higher degree and thus tuck away a greater profit. The contention that the capitalist can raise the prices of luxury articles because the demand for these declines, as a result of the reduced demand of the capitalists whose means of purchasing them have diminished, would be an extremely original application of the law of supply and demand. Inasmuch as there is not just a shift in the buyers, workers replacing capitalists, and to the extent that this displacement occurs, the workers' demand does not operate to raise the price of the necessary means of subsistence, since the part of their additional wages that the workers spend on articles of luxury cannot be spent by them on necessary means of subsistence. The prices of luxury goods fall as a consequence of the reduced demand. As a result, capital is withdrawn from their production until their supply is reduced to the extent that corresponds with their changed role in the social production process. With this reduction in production, they rise again to their normal prices, given that their values are unchanged. While this contraction or balancing process is taking place, the same amount of additional capital will be supplied for the production of means of subsistence, whose prices are rising, as is withdrawn from the other branch of production until demand is satisfied. There is then once again an equilibrium, and the conclusion of the whole process is that the social capital, and hence also the money capital, is divided between the production of necessary means of subsistence and that of luxury goods in changed proportions. The entire objection is a red herring brought in by the capitalists and their economic sycophants. The facts that provide the pretext for this diversion are of three kinds. 1. It is a general law of monetary circulation that if the sum of the prices of goods in circulation rises, whether this increase is for the same volume of commodities or for an increased volume, with other circumstances remaining the same, the quantity of money in circulation grows. The effect is then taken for the cause. However, wages rise, even if seldom and proportionately only in exceptional cases, with the increased price of the necessary means of subsistence. Their rise is the result of the rise in commodity prices and not the cause of this. 2. Given a partial or local rise in wages, i.e. a rise in just a few branches of production, it is possible that a local rise in prices for the products of this branch may result. But even this depends on many circumstances. For example, that wages were not abnormally depressed here and hence the rate of profit abnormally high. that the market for these commodities was not constricted by a rise in price, and thus that a rise in their prices does not depend on a preceding contraction in their supply, etc. 3. With the general rise in wages, the price of goods produced in branches of industry in which variable capital is predominant rises, whereas prices fall in those branches in which constant or fixed capital predominates. In the case of simple commodity circulation, see Volume 1, Chapter 3, Section 2, we showed that even if the money form is only transient in the circulation of a particular quantity of commodities, the money transiently in the hands of one person in the commodity metamorphosis still necessarily finds its way into the hands of someone else, and so not only are commodities exchanged on all sides, replacing each other, but this replacement is also mediated and accompanied by a precipitation of money on all sides. Quote from Volume 1. When one commodity replaces another, the money commodity always sticks to the hands of some third person. Circulation sweats money from every pore. End quote. The very same fact is expressed on the basis of capitalist commodity production by the constant retention of a part of capital in the form of money capital, and the constant presence of a part of the surplus value similarly in the money form in the hands of its proprietor. Apart from this, the circuit of money, i.e. the return of the money to its starting point, inasmuch as this forms a moment of the turnover of capital, is a phenomenon completely different from and even opposed to the circulation of money, which expresses its constant removal from its starting point through a series of hands. See Volume 1, page 210. However, an accelerated turnover involves by its very nature an accelerated circulation. To take the case of variable capital first. If, for example, a money capital of £500 turns over 10 times a year in the form of variable capital, it is clear that this aliquot part of the quantity of money in circulation circulates 10 times its sum of values. It circulates 10 times in the year between capitalist and worker. The worker is paid, and himself pays, 10 times in the year with the same aliquot part of the quantity of money in circulation. If this variable capital were to turn over once in the year with the same scale of production, then there would only be one circulation of £5,000. Furthermore, the constant part of the circulating capital is £1,000. If the capital turns over 10 times, then the capitalist sells his commodity 10 times in the year, and thus also the constant circulating part of its value with it. The same aliquot part of the money quantity in circulation, £1,000, passes 10 times in the year from the hands of its owner to those of the capitalist. There are 10 changes of place from one hand to another. Secondly, the capitalist buys the means of production 10 times in the year. These are again 10 circulations of money from one hand to another. With money to the total of £1,000, commodities for £10,000 are sold by the industrial capitalist, and other commodities of £10,000 are bought. By a 20-fold circulation of £1,000 of money, a commodity stock of £20,000 is circulated. Finally, accelerated turnover also leads to a quicker circulation of the portion of money that realizes surplus value. Conversely, however, a more rapid monetary circulation does not necessarily involve a more rapid turnover of capital, and hence also of money, i.e., there is not necessarily a shortening and more rapid renewal of the reproduction process. More rapid monetary circulation takes place whenever a greater volume of transactions is completed with the same quantity of money. This can also be the case without a change in the reproduction period of the capital as a result of changed technical arrangements for monetary circulation. Further, the volume of transactions in which money circulates can increase without this expressing a real replacement of commodities, speculation in futures on the stock exchange, etc. On the other hand, certain monetary circulations can completely disappear. Where the agriculturalist is his own landlord, for example, there is no monetary circulation between farmer and landlord. Where the industrial capitalist is himself the owner of his capital, there is no circulation between him and a creditor. As for the question of the original formation of a money hoard in a country, as well as the appropriation of it by a few people, it is not necessary to go into this in detail here. The capitalist mode of production, since its basis is wage labor, and therefore also the payment of the worker in money and the general transformation of services in kind into money payments, can develop on a large scale and penetrate deeply only when there is a quantity of money in the country in question sufficient for circulation and for the hoard formation, reserve fund, etc., conditioned by this circulation. This is a historical precondition, even if the situation should not be conceived in such a way that a sufficient hoard has first to be formed before capitalist production can begin. The latter rather develops simultaneously with the development of its preconditions, and one of these preconditions is a sufficient supply of precious metals. Hence, the increased supply of precious metals from the 16th century onwards was a decisive moment in the historical development of capitalist production. Insofar as we are dealing with the further supply of money material needed on the basis of the capitalist mode of production, we can say that on the one hand, surplus value is cast into circulation in the product without the money for its conversion, while on the other hand, surplus value in gold is cast into circulation without its previous transformation from product into money. The additional commodities that have to be transformed into money find the sums of money needed available because, on the other hand, additional gold and silver is cast into circulation by production itself, not by exchange, and has to be transformed into commodities. Section 2. Accumulation and expanded reproduction. The case in which accumulation takes place in the form of reproduction on an expanded scale clearly does not offer any new problems with respect to money circulation. As far as the additional money capital is concerned, that required for the function of the increased productive capital, this is supplied by the portion of the realized surplus value that is cast into circulation by the capitalists as money capital, instead of as the money form of revenue. The money is already in the hands of the capitalists. It is simply its application that differs. Now, however, as a result of the addition to the productive capital, an additional mass of commodities is cast into circulation as its product. Together with this extra mass of commodities, a part of the extra money needed for their realization is also cast in, to the extent that the value of this mass of commodities contains the value of the productive capital consumed in their production. This additional quantity of money is advanced precisely as additional money capital, and hence returns to the capitalist with the turnover of his capital. Here, the same question comes up again as before. Where does the extra money come from to realize the extra surplus value that now exists in the commodity form? The general reply is again the same. The total price of the mass of commodities in circulation has increased, not because the price of a given mass of commodities has risen, but rather because the mass of commodities now in circulation is greater than that of the commodities circulating earlier, without this having been balanced by any fall in prices. The additional money required for the circulation of this increased commodity mass of a greater value must be created either by a more economic use of the quantity of money in circulation, whether by directly balancing payments, etc., or by means that accelerate the circulation of the same pieces of money, or alternatively by the transformation of money from the hoard form into the circulating form. This does not just imply that idle money capital begins to function as a means of purchase or payment, or that money capital already functioning as a reserve fund while continuing to perform the function of a reserve fund for its owners circulates actively for the society, as with deposits in banks which are constantly lent out, and thus performs a double function. It also means that stagnant reserves of coin are used more economically. Quote from A Contribution to the Critique of Political Economy by Karl Marx. So that money as coin may flow continuously, coin must continuously congeal into money. The continual movement of coin implies its perpetual stagnation in larger or smaller amounts in reserve funds of coin which arise everywhere within the framework of circulation, and which are at the same time a condition of circulation. The formation, distribution, dissolution, and reformation of these funds constantly changes. Existing funds disappear continuously, and their disappearance is a continuous fact. This unceasing transformation of coin into money, and of money into coin, was expressed by Adam Smith when he said that, in addition to the particular commodity that he sells, every commodity owner must always keep in stock a certain amount of the general commodity with which he buys. We have seen that M to C, the second member of the circuit C to M to C, splits up into a series of purchases, which are not effected all at once, but successively over a period of time, so that one part of M circulates as coin, while the other part remains at rest as money. In this case, money is in fact only suspended coin, and the various components of the coinage in circulation appear, constantly changing, now in one form, now in another. The first transformation of the medium of circulation into money constitutes, therefore, merely a technical aspect of the circulation of money. End quote. Coin, as opposed to money, is used here to denote money in its function as means of circulation, as opposed to its other functions. To the extent that all these means together were not enough, there must be additional production of gold, or what comes to the same thing, a part of the additional product must be exchanged either directly or indirectly for gold, the product of those countries that produce precious metals. The sum of labor power and social means of production that is spent in the annual production of gold and silver as instruments of circulation forms a heavy item of faux frais for the capitalist mode of production, or more generally, for a mode of production based on commodity circulation. It withdraws from social use a corresponding sum of possible additional means of production and consumption, i.e. of real wealth. To the extent that the costs of this expensive machinery of circulation are reduced, with the scale of production remaining the same, i.e. at a given level of its extension, the productive forces of social labor are correspondingly heightened. Thus, inasmuch as the auxiliary means that develop with credit have this effect, they directly increase capitalist wealth, whether this is because a greater part of the social production and labor process is thereby accomplished without the intervention of real money, or because the capacity of the actually functioning quantity of money to fulfill its function is thereby increased. This also disposes of the pointless question of whether capitalist production on its present scale would be possible without credit, even considered from this standpoint alone, i.e. with a merely metallic circulation. It would clearly not be possible. It would come up against the limited scale of precious metal production. On the other hand, we should not get any mystical ideas about the productive power of the credit system just because this makes money capital available or fluid. But the further development of this point does not belong here. We must now consider the case where there is not actual accumulation, i.e. direct expansion of the scale of production, but where a part of the surplus value realized is stored up over a longer or shorter time as a monetary reserve fund, so as later to be transformed into productive capital. Insofar as the money thus accumulated is extra money, the situation is very clear. This money can only be a part of the additional gold supplied by the gold-producing countries. It should be noted in this connection that the domestic products in return for which this gold is imported no longer exist in the country in question. They have been dispensed abroad in exchange for gold. If we assume, on the other hand, that there is the same quantity of money in the country as before, then the money that has been stored away or is being stored away has flowed in from circulation. It is simply its function that has changed. It has been transformed from circulating money into a gradually formed latent money capital. The money that is stored up here is the money form of commodities that have been sold, and moreover of that portion of their value that represents surplus value for their owner. The credit system is assumed here to be non-existent. The capitalist who stores up money has to that extent sold without buying. If we look upon this process simply as a partial phenomenon, there is nothing in it that needs explaining. One group of capitalists keep back part of the money they obtain from the sale of their products instead of using it to withdraw products from the market. Another group, on the other hand, transform their money into products, with the exception of the constantly recurring money capital needed to carry on production. A part of the product thrown onto the market as a bearer of surplus value consists of means of production, or of the real elements of variable capital, the necessary means of subsistence. It can therefore immediately serve to expand production, for it is in no way assumed that one group of capitalists accumulates money capital while the other group completely consume their surplus value, but simply that one group carry out the accumulation in the money form and build up latent money capital while the others really do accumulate, i.e. expand the scale of production, actually expand their productive capital. The quantity of money present remains sufficient for the needs of circulation, even if it is alternately one group of capitalists who store up money while the other group expand their scale of production, and vice versa. The storing up of money on the one side can proceed even without cash, simply through the piling up of credit notes. But difficulties start to arise when we assume not partial accumulation of money capital but general accumulation within the capitalist class. Outside this class, on our assumption, that of the universal and exclusive domination of capitalist production, there is no other class except the working class. The total purchases of the working class are equal to the sum of their wages, i.e. the sum of the variable capital advanced by the entire capitalist class as a whole. This money flows back to the latter through the sale of their product to the working class. Their variable capital thereby receives its money form. If the sum of variable capital is X times £100, this is not the total variable capital advanced in the year, but only that applied. Whether this variable capital value is advanced with more money or less during the year, according to the speed of the turnover, does not affect the question at present under discussion. With this capital of X times £100, the capitalist class buys a certain quantity of labor power, or pays wages to a certain number of workers. First transaction. The workers use this sum to buy a certain value of commodities from the capitalists, and in this way the sum of X times £100 returns to the hands of the capitalists. Second transaction. This process is constantly repeated. The sum of X times £100 can therefore never enable the working class to buy the part of the product which contains the constant capital, let alone the surplus value which belongs to the capitalists. The workers can buy with X times £100 only a portion of the value of the social product equal to the portion of value which represents the value of the variable capital advanced. Apart from the case in which this all-round monetary accumulation simply expresses the division, in whatever proportions, between the various individual capitalists of the additional precious metal which has been brought in, how else is the entire capitalist class to accumulate money? They would all have to have sold a part of their product without buying again. It is nothing mysterious that they all possess a certain money fund which they cast into the circulation sphere as means of circulation for their consumption, and of which each receives a certain part back again from the circulation sphere. But this monetary fund is then precisely a circulation fund, acquired by the conversion into money of surplus value. It does not consist at all of latent money capital. If we consider the way things happen in real life, we can say that the latent money capital that is stored up for later use consists of 1. Bank deposits, and the money that the banks really dispose of is a relatively small sum. Here it is only nominally stored up as money capital. What is really stored up are monetary claims which are only convertible, to the extent that they are ever converted, because there is a balance between money drawn out and the money put in. The money that exists in the hands of the bank is relatively only a small sum. 2. Government papers. These are not capital at all, but simply outstanding claims on the nation's annual product. 3. Shares. Leaving aside the fraudulent ones, these are titles of ownership to a real capital belonging to a corporate body, and drafts on the surplus value that flow in from this each year. In all these cases, there is no storage of money, and what appears on the one hand as storage of money capital appears on the other hand as the continuous real expenditure of money. Whether the money is spent by the person it belongs to or by other people, by people in debt to him, does not affect the situation. On the basis of capitalist production, the formation of a hoard as such is never a purpose but rather a result either of a stagnation in circulation, and that greater quantities of money than usual assume the hoard form, or of the storage required by the turnover. The hoard can also, finally, be simply a formation of money capital, in the latent form for the time being, but destined to function as productive capital. If, on the one hand, therefore, a part of the surplus value realized in money is withdrawn from circulation and stored up as a hoard, at the same time, a further part of the surplus value is always transformed into productive capital. With the exception of the division of additional precious metal among the capitalist class, storage in the money form never occurs simultaneously at all points. The same applies to that part of the annual product which represents surplus value in the commodity form, as applies to the rest of the annual product. A certain sum of money is required for its circulation. This sum of money belongs just as much to the capitalist class as does the annually produced mass of commodities that represent surplus value. It was originally cast into circulation by the capitalist class itself. It is continuously divided among them afresh by circulation. Just as with the circulation of coin in general, a part of this monetary surplus value is held up at ever-changing points while the further part is always circulating. Whether some of this storage is deliberate in order to form money capital does not affect the situation in any way. Here we have disregarded the vicissitudes of circulation, in which one capitalist seizes for himself a piece of another's surplus value, and even of his capital, and there is therefore a one-sided accumulation and centralization of both money capital and productive capital. A part of the extorted surplus value that A stores up as money capital may thus be a fragment of B's surplus value that has failed to return to him. End of Part 2.